After selling my company for $23 million, I threw a retirement party. Right before the toast, I watched my daughter-in-law slip something into my champagne. When no one was looking, I quietly switched glasses with her mother. Within minutes, she began to. The late summer sun dipped slowly behind the Rocky Mountains, casting a warm golden hue over the sprawling backyard of Rick Wallace's Colorado estate. Lanterns flickered on the patio, subtle jazz played from hidden speakers, and the air was thick with laughter, clinking glasses, and the soft hum of conversation. It was the kind of evening meant to be remembered, a farewell to an empire built from scratch, and a celebration of freedom hard-earned. Rick, now 62, stood near the edge of the pool, dressed in a crisp navy suit, no tie, collar open, relaxed but composed. His silver hair caught the sunlight just right, and the faint creases on his face gave him a quiet gravitas. For over 3 decades, he had been the mind and soul behind Wallace Systems, a tech consulting firm that started in his garage and had just been sold to a major Silicon Valley conglomerate for $23 million. He had done it. He had won the game. Guests meandered through the manicured lawn, champagne flutes in hand, sharing memories of product launches, late-night deadlines, and the impossible deals Rick had somehow always closed. There were former partners, competitors turned friends, even a few former interns now running their own startups. It was a curated mix of the professional and the personal, including family, of course. Rick's son, Mark, was chatting with a group near the fire pit, drink in hand. At 34, he looked every bit his father's son, lean, sharply dressed, charming when he needed to be. But Rick often found it difficult to read him, especially in recent years. Their conversations had grown shorter, surface level. Mark had always shown interest in business, but he had never joined Wallace Systems. Instead, he'd chosen real estate and married young, to Emily. Rick's gaze slid subtly toward his daughter-in-law, who was standing near the outdoor bar, smiling at something her mother, Deborah, had just said. Emily had always been polite, cordial, beautiful in that glossy, calculated way. But she wasn't warm, and Rick had never felt entirely at ease around her. There had been no falling out, no overt conflict, just a quiet distance, the kind that suggested mutual wariness more than affection. As Rick made his way through the crowd, shaking hands and accepting congratulations with practiced humility, he couldn't help but feel a shift under the surface, like a faint ripple in still water. Maybe it was the weight of the transition, the first time in decades he had no board meeting to prepare for, no quarterly numbers to chase. Or maybe it was something else. Something in the air. He walked back inside the house briefly, needing a moment to collect his thoughts before the speech. The living room was dimly lit, calm. On the fireplace mantel stood framed photos from every era of his life: college, wedding, Mark's childhood, the first Wallace Systems office, the groundbreaking of the new headquarters. He had given everything to build something lasting. And now that it was over, he wondered, what next? When he stepped back outside, someone handed him a flute of champagne. He took it with a nod, then approached the small platform set up near the back patio. Conversations dimmed as people turned toward him. He waited a beat, letting the silence settle. "Friends," he began, lifting his glass slightly, "thank you. Tonight isn't just a celebration of a business deal, it's a farewell to an identity I've worn for over 30 years. Building Wallace Systems was the ride of a lifetime. But more than anything, I'm grateful for the people who stood by me, not just during the highs, but through the years when it all could have crumbled." Scattered applause. Nods. He smiled. "I won't pretend to know what retirement looks like for me. I suspect I'll find new ways to stay busy, gardening, grandparenting, or maybe even learning how to sit still for once." Laughter rippled through the crowd. "But one thing I do know, tonight, I'm surrounded by people who matter. Family. Friends. People I trust." He paused, his eyes flicking briefly toward Emily, who was now at the drinks table again. She wasn't looking at him. She was focused on the champagne flutes. Something about her movements caught his attention. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but her hand hesitated slightly as she hovered over one particular glass. She glanced around quickly, then adjusted the position of the flute with a care that didn't seem casual. Rick's chest tightened. He had seen enough in boardrooms to recognize precision masquerading as spontaneity. Something about the motion, the timing, felt too calculated. He didn't move. Didn't react. Instead, he smiled through the rest of his speech, concluding with a simple, heartfelt line, "To all of you, thank you for being part of this journey. Here's to whatever comes next." As glasses were raised, Rick slowly stepped down from the platform, weaving through guests until he reached the table. Emily had stepped away, now laughing at something her mother was saying nearby. The glass she had handled, he was almost certain he could tell which one it was, still sat untouched. His own, the one he had been handed, sat in his left hand. Without breaking stride, Rick executed a silent, practiced switch, placing his original glass down and picking up the one Emily had seemingly chosen for him. A small voice in the back of his mind told him he might be overreacting. But another, colder voice whispered that he hadn't gotten this far in life by ignoring his instincts. He walked away, found Deborah, and handed her the flute with a gentle nod. "You're the only one here who might keep me in check tonight," he said with a chuckle. She laughed and took it. "Cheers to that." They clinked glasses. Minutes later, Deborah was seated on a bench under the pergola, fanning herself lightly. Her face had gone pale. She looked dizzy, disoriented. Rick noticed first. Then a few others. Conversations faltered. Mark rushed over. Emily followed, a concerned expression frozen on her face, almost too perfectly timed. Rick stood at a distance, glass still in hand, heart pounding. He wasn't certain of what he had just witnessed. But he was sure of one thing. Something was deeply wrong. And it had only just begun. Deborah's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the edge of the bench, her breathing uneven. A few beads of sweat had formed along her hairline despite the cool mountain air. Mark stood over her, one hand on her shoulder, his voice hushed and urgent. Emily hovered nearby, her face molded into concern, yet Rick watched her carefully. Her worry seemed more rehearsed than real, like a practiced expression one would wear during a staged performance. He'd seen that look before, in business meetings where someone tried too hard to feign innocence. "I think it's just the heat," Deborah muttered weakly, though her tone lacked conviction. "The sun's been down for a while," Mark said, glancing at her forehead. "You're sweating." Rick approached, slow and deliberate. He hadn't taken a sip from the champagne flute he now held loosely at his side. "Let's move her inside," he suggested calmly. "She might need to lie down." With assistance, Deborah stood shakily. Emily reached out to support her mother, but Rick stepped in and took her other arm, feeling how limp and unsteady she was. They guided her through the sliding doors into the house, settling her on the guest bed in one of the spare rooms off the main hallway. The lights were dimmed. Mark fetched a damp cloth from the bathroom while Emily stood in the doorway, arms crossed, chewing the inside of her cheek. "She just needs to rest," Emily said quickly, her voice slightly clipped. "Mom gets like this sometimes. It's probably her blood sugar." Rick knelt beside the bed, observing Deborah's expression. Her eyes were open, but her gaze was unfocused. Her skin had taken on a waxy pallor, and her breath came in shallow bursts. He leaned closer. "Deborah," he said quietly, "can you hear me?" Her lips moved, but only a faint whisper escaped, "I feel dizzy." Mark returned with the cloth and pressed it gently against his mother-in-law's forehead. Rick stepped back, watching closely as the seconds ticked by. Deborah seemed marginally more alert, but her condition hadn't improved meaningfully. "Do you want me to call an ambulance?" Mark asked Emily, clearly unsure. "No," Emily answered too quickly. "She doesn't like hospitals. Honestly, she'll be fine. Just needs to sleep this off." Rick frowned. "It's not a matter of what she likes, Emily. Something's not right." Emily looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You think I don't know my own mother?" Rick met her gaze without blinking. "That's not what I said." Silence stretched in the room for a moment before Deborah murmured again. "Water." Mark stood. "I'll get it." When he left the room, Rick turned to Emily. She was standing still, her eyes fixed on her mother. For the first time that evening, her mask seemed to slip, not completely, but enough. There was no fear in her expression. No panic. Just calculation. Rick said nothing. He simply stepped out of the room and went to the kitchen, walking past Mark on the way. "I'll get the water," Rick told him. "Go stay with your mother-in-law." Mark nodded and turned back. In the kitchen, Rick moved quickly but silently. He opened a cabinet and pulled a clean tumbler from the top shelf. Then, glancing toward the hallway to make sure he was alone, he opened the under-sink trash bin. Inside, partially concealed beneath a layer of crumpled napkins and a used plastic plate, was a small, dark glass bottle. He had noticed it earlier when clearing a dish. Something about the shape and labeling had stood out. Now he pulled it free. The label was mostly intact. The name of the drug printed in sharp medical font, Zalavan, Zalplan 10 mg. A prescription sedative. Fast-acting. Meant for short-term insomnia. A note at the bottom warned, "Do not consume with alcohol." Rick stared at it, feeling the first genuine chill of the night settle into his bones. This wasn't an accident. Someone had brought this here, used it here. And there was only one glass in the entire party that had looked tampered with. He took the bottle and slipped it into his coat pocket before returning with the water. Back in the guest room, Deborah had started to regain a little color, though she still looked pale and sluggish. Rick handed her the water. She took a few slow sips before resting her head back. "We'll let you rest," he said softly. He ushered everyone out of the room and closed the door partway behind him. Mark lingered in the hallway, visibly worried. Emily had returned to the patio where guests still mingled, unaware of the sudden undercurrent of tension running through the evening. "Dad," Mark began, rubbing the back of his neck. "What do you think happened?" Rick gave a noncommittal shrug. "Could be nothing. Could be a reaction to something she ate. Maybe too much sun earlier today." Mark looked unconvinced, but didn't press further. "She's always been a little dramatic," he said, as if trying to reassure himself. Rick didn't answer. Instead, he clapped his son on the shoulder. "Why don't you go check on the guests? I'll stay here for a bit." After Mark walked away, Rick slipped back into the guest room. Deborah had drifted into a light sleep, the glass of water on the nightstand untouched after that initial sip. Rick sat in the corner chair, pulled out his phone, and began typing a name into the search bar, Zalavan Interactions. The results confirmed what he already suspected: alcohol amplified the sedative effects significantly. High doses or improper combinations could cause sudden dizziness, fainting, or worse. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Was Deborah the intended target? Or had she been collateral? Rick's mind returned to the moment Emily handled the glasses. She hadn't poured the drinks. She had only adjusted the placement, subtly enough that most people wouldn't have noticed. But Rick had. Years of scanning for micro-expressions and slight shifts in negotiation rooms had trained his eye. He thought of all the signs he had ignored. How Emily never really tried to build a genuine relationship with him. How Mark had grown quieter, more reserved, since their wedding. The email he had dismissed weeks ago, something about watch the people closest to you, it now felt like a warning ignored. Rick stood and walked to the hallway. From the front of the house, he could hear laughter again, someone opening another bottle of wine. The party was winding down. People were preparing to leave. Life, for everyone else, was moving forward as though nothing had happened. But for Rick, something had shifted. The equilibrium of trust that held his family together had cracked. And he knew himself well enough to understand what came next. He wouldn't sleep. He wouldn't rest. Not until he understood everything. Later that night, after the last car pulled out of the long driveway and silence returned to the house, Rick sat alone in his study. The small bottle was on the desk in front of him. He stared at it for a long while before opening a locked drawer and pulling out a leather-bound notebook, an old habit from his earliest days in business. He flipped to a clean page and wrote a single line. "She meant for me to drink it." The silence around him felt heavier now. Rick turned out the light, but not before placing the bottle in a sealed envelope. The party was over. The game had just begun. The next morning arrived with the smell of pine drifting through the open windows and the distant hum of a landscaper's blower in the neighboring yard. Rick had barely slept. After the final guest had left the night before, he had checked on Deborah once more, finding her asleep, her breathing steady but shallow. He left a note on the guest room nightstand and let her rest. Now, in the light of day, the edges of what had happened felt sharper, more immediate. Downstairs, the house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the old hardwood floor. The kitchen, still showing signs of the previous night's gathering, was cluttered with used glasses and half-eaten hors d'oeuvres. Rick ignored it all and moved straight to the living room, where his son was standing at the window, sipping coffee, staring out at the mountains without really seeing them. Rick studied him for a moment before making a sound that let Mark know he wasn't alone. Mark turned around and nodded. "Morning," he said, his voice low and scratchy. "Morning," Rick replied, stepping closer. "How's Deborah?" Mark shrugged. "Emily checked on her around 6. She was still sleeping. Breathing better. I think she'll be okay." Rick didn't respond immediately. He walked over to the sideboard, poured himself a glass of water, and took a sip. Mark set his coffee cup down. "Listen. I wanted to talk to you about last night." Rick turned slowly. "All right." Mark seemed hesitant, the way a man might feel before stepping into cold water. "I know it looked strange. Mom fainting like that. Emily was upset. We both were. I know Emily may not show it like most people, but she was worried." Rick leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "She didn't seem upset. She seemed rehearsed." Mark's eyes narrowed. "That's not fair." Rick didn't flinch. "Neither is what happened." A long silence stretched between them. The unspoken tension crackled like static. Finally, Mark exhaled sharply and sat on the edge of the couch, rubbing his hands together. "I know you've never liked her much," he said quietly. Rick looked at his son. "This isn't about liking someone, Mark. It's about trust. You saw what happened. Your mother-in-law collapsed after drinking from a glass your wife handled. That doesn't seem strange to you?" Mark didn't answer. He stared down at his hands, fidgeting. Rick watched him carefully. There it was again, that flicker of something in his son's expression. Not just confusion. Not just concern. Fear. "Mark," Rick said, softer now. "Is there something you're not telling me?" Mark's jaw clenched. "No." Rick didn't move. "Are you sure?" Mark stood abruptly and walked to the window again, his back to his father. "You think Emily tried to poison you, don't you?" His voice was low, accusatory. Rick didn't answer right away. "I think something happened last night that wasn't accidental." Mark turned around, his face flushed. "You're paranoid. You've always been suspicious of her. Always kept her at arm's length." "She's my wife, Dad." Rick nodded slowly. "I know. And that's why I'm talking to you instead of the police." That stopped Mark cold. Rick walked to the bar cart and retrieved the envelope containing the small bottle. He held it up. This was in the trash. Zalavan. A strong sedative. Not something someone would casually bring to a party unless they planned to use it. Mark's expression shifted, first confusion, then alarm, then something darker. He looked at the envelope like it might bite him. "You're serious?" he said. Rick opened the flap and showed him the bottle. "I found this after Deborah collapsed. I didn't drink the glass Emily intended for me. I switched it. With Deborah's." Mark staggered back a step, stunned. "Wait," You're saying, she was the test run? Rick nodded once. Or the wrong target? Mark moved to a chair and dropped into it, silent for several long seconds. Rick could see the war happening behind his son's eyes, the push and pull between what he wanted to believe and what he might already know. I didn't know anything about this, Mark said finally, his voice hollow. Rick watched him carefully. You're telling me the truth? Mark met his father's gaze, and for a moment, Rick saw the boy he used to carry on his shoulders through airport terminals and ballparks. The boy who once cried when he lost his first dog. There was pain in his eyes now, but also guilt. I swear to God, Mark said. I didn't know anything. But... Rick waited. But? Mark shook his head slowly. Emily's been distant. Secretive. I chalked it up to stress, pressure. She's been talking a lot about money lately. About long-term plans. Retirement accounts, real estate transfers, stuff I never paid attention to. She keeps saying we need to be smart now that you're stepping back. That your legacy should be protected. Rick raised an eyebrow. Protected from what? Mark swallowed. She thinks you're reckless. That you give too much to charity, that you don't think about the future. Rick gave a bitter laugh. She's not entirely wrong. Mark looked at him, pleading. She's not a monster. Maybe she just got carried away. Rick leaned forward. Getting carried away is overspending. Not drugging someone's drink. Mark dropped his head into his hands. Jesus. Rick stood and walked toward the window, his mind already moving faster than the conversation. The pieces were starting to fit together, not all of them, but enough to see a picture forming. She's done something, hasn't she? He said without turning. Or she's planning to. Mark didn't respond. That silence was its own kind of confession. Rick turned back to him. I need you to be honest with me, Mark. Completely honest. If there's something going on, now's the time to tell me. Because I won't be quiet forever. Mark looked up slowly, a haunted look in his eyes. There's something I saw a few weeks ago. On her computer. A scanned copy of your signature. Attached to a file. I asked her about it and she said it was part of some estate planning document. I didn't think twice. Rick narrowed his eyes. What kind of file? I don't know, Mark said. A PDF. Something with the title Living Trust Amendment. She closed the window quickly. Said it was just a draft. Rick's pulse quickened. Did she have access to any of my passwords? I don't think so. But I know she had lunch with a lawyer in Florida a few months ago. She said it was about a property deal. Rick nodded once, already committing every detail to memory. Mark looked up. What are you going to do? Rick's face was calm, but his voice was firm. I'm going to find out how deep this goes. Quietly. I don't want her spooked. Yet. Mark looked ashamed, as if finally realizing the full scope of what was unfolding. I never thought, he began, but couldn't finish the sentence. Rick didn't need him to. He already understood. Outside, the sun was rising higher, casting sharp lines of light across the hardwood floor. Inside, a different kind of light was dawning, one that revealed shadows no one wanted to face. Rick had spent his life anticipating threats in business. Now he was learning to anticipate them in blood. By early afternoon, Rick was sitting in his office, door locked, blinds drawn, a yellow notepad in front of him filled with disjointed notes, arrows, and circled phrases. Names, dates, guesses. He had always trusted his instincts in business. They had guided him through mergers, acquisitions, even hostile takeovers. But this time, the stakes were deeply personal, and the margin for error felt razor thin. He didn't want to involve the police yet. He needed clarity. Evidence. A mistake at this stage could push Emily into covering her tracks or, worse, making another move. That's when he remembered someone he hadn't spoken to in years, Troy Daniels, a former FBI field agent turned private investigator. They had worked together once when Rick's company had been targeted by a patent troll with ties to organized fraud. Troy was expensive, discreet, and most importantly, thorough. Rick picked up his phone, scrolled through his encrypted contacts app, and dialed. Troy Daniels. Troy. It's Rick Wallace. A pause. Then, Rick. Been a while. What can I do for you? I need you for something personal. Off record. Quiet. Are you still in Denver? I can be there in 90 minutes. They met in a small corner booth at an old steakhouse in Boulder, a place with stiff drinks, red leather seating, and waiters who knew better than to interrupt anything that looked like a serious conversation. Troy was lean, sharp-eyed, dressed like someone who blended into airports and corporate lobbies without notice. He still carried himself like someone who could dismantle a person in seconds, physically or psychologically. Rick explained everything in a calm, calculated tone: the champagne switch, the pill bottle, Deborah's reaction, Emily's odd behavior, and the conversation with Mark. He gave Troy the envelope with the sedative bottle and mentioned the suspicious file Mark had seen on Emily's computer. Troy didn't react emotionally. He just listened, then asked a single question. Do you want me to find out what she's done, or what she's planning to do? Both. Troy nodded. Then I'll need access. Her phone, laptop, email, financial records, everything. Rick slid a thumb drive across the table. I cloned her laptop 2 nights ago when she left it charging in my office. She thought I was asleep. Password was her wedding date. Troy raised an eyebrow, impressed. You always did your homework. I learned from the best. Troy tucked the drive into his coat pocket. I'll start there. And I'll run background checks on anyone connected to her, especially the lawyer in Florida. What's his name? Don't know yet. But I'll find out. Good. Give me 72 hours. Rick leaned back. Troy. Be careful. She's not reckless. She's methodical. Even better, Troy said, finishing his coffee. Methodical people leave patterns. Later that evening, Rick returned home to find Emily and Mark sitting on the back patio, drinks in hand. The tension between them was visible, the kind that clung to the air even when nothing was being said. Mark barely looked up when Rick appeared. You're back, Emily said, standing. She was wearing a pale blue sweater and jeans, casual, almost deliberately soft in appearance. Rick nodded. Had to run errands. Picked up some steaks if you want to grill. Emily smiled. Sounds great. I was just telling Mark we should do something normal tonight. Relax a little. Things have been tense. Rick studied her face. Her performance was flawless: warmth, concern, inclusion. But it was too polished, too perfect. Sure, he said. Let's keep it light tonight. Dinner was uneventful on the surface. They talked about nothing: local construction on the main road, a neighbor's new dog, some celebrity divorce trending on the news. Emily steered the conversation, always cheerful, always smiling. But Rick noticed how she kept glancing at Mark, as if checking whether he was still loyal. When Mark excused himself after dessert, Rick and Emily were briefly alone in the kitchen. She leaned against the counter, arms folded, watching him load the dishwasher. I hope you're not angry, she said, tone casual. Rick glanced at her. About what? Last night. It was chaotic. I feel like you think I did something wrong. Rick dried a glass with a towel. Why would I think that? She shrugged. Just a feeling. You've been quiet today. Just tired, he said, setting the glass down. Big night. Lot of people. Lot of memories. Emily smiled, but her eyes didn't match the expression. You're not retiring from thinking, though. Are you? Rick didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked out, leaving her in the kitchen. It wasn't time to strike, not yet. He needed to know how deep this went. The next morning, Rick checked his secure inbox. A message from Troy was waiting. Subject line, first thread pulled. No body. Just an attachment, a PDF file containing a preliminary report. Rick opened it, scanning the data. Emily had opened a separate bank account 3 months ago under her maiden name in Florida. The address on file was a law office in Tampa. Attached to the account was a power of attorney form bearing what appeared to be Rick's signature. A forensic scan suggested it was digitally altered from a scanned business contract signed 4 years earlier. The lawyer listed on the form, Peter Langston. Known for shady estate planning cases and under investigation in at least 2 civil suits involving elderly clients. There was more. Flight records. Emily had flown to Tampa twice in the last 3 months, once alone, once claiming she was visiting a cousin in Dallas. No cousin listed in any known family tree. Rick closed the file and sat in silence. The room felt colder. She wasn't just planning something. She had already started executing it. That evening, Rick made a decision. He pulled a small recording device from a drawer, the kind designed to be hidden in plain sight, and placed it beneath the couch cushion in the living room where Emily often took calls. He adjusted the house's smart thermostat to detect motion, triggering silent recordings whenever someone entered specific zones. Then, using a separate app, he synced everything to a cloud drive under a masked email address. He wasn't paranoid. He was preparing. 3 days passed. Rick acted normal. Played his part. Smiled. Dined. Asked about real estate markets like he was genuinely interested in Emily's theories. Each night, he uploaded the data Troy requested. Each day, new pieces arrived, documents, flagged emails, screenshots. A map was forming. A plan, carefully constructed, built on false paperwork and digital signatures, with just enough ambiguity to pass casual inspection. Until now. One night, as Rick returned from a walk, he heard Emily in the living room. She was on the phone, unaware of the recorder beneath her. Yes. He suspects something, she said. I don't think he drank it. No, I didn't see him switch the glass, but he was watching me. And now he's watching everything. I think we're going to have to move faster. A pause. No, I don't trust Deborah. She's panicking. If she says anything, it'll ruin everything. I told her to shut up and stay calm. I'm not going to jail over her mistakes. Rick stood frozen outside the window, heart pounding. There it was. Proof. He turned back, stepped silently through the side door, and made his way to the study. The voice recorder had already uploaded the conversation. He sat down, opened the app, and hit play. It was clear. Crisp. Unmistakable. Emily had tried to drug him. Emily was conspiring with someone. Emily had just become her own worst enemy. The next morning, Rick sat at his desk before sunrise, the first hint of pale light stretching across the trees beyond the wide study window. A steaming mug of black coffee rested beside his laptop. He had already listened to the recorded conversation between Emily and her unknown contact 3 times, dissecting every pause, every inflection. She had revealed just enough to confirm his suspicions, but not enough to identify who else was involved. Still, one thing was now certain, she was panicking. And panic was leverage. He opened his laptop and began searching his old email archives. He remembered a strange message from a few weeks before the retirement party. At the time, he had dismissed it as spam or paranoia, an anonymous tip claiming someone close to him was preparing to move against him. It had come through a secure contact form on his old corporate site, which had been taken down shortly after the sale of Wallace Systems. He had filed it away without a second thought. Now, he regretted that. After 10 minutes of combing through layers of archived folders, he found it. Subject, a word of caution. The message was short. No greeting, no signature. Someone close to you is planning something you won't see coming. You've built your life on trusting your instincts, don't ignore them now. Her name is already on paperwork you haven't signed. He read the message 3 times, noting the phrasing. Her name. Not they. Not vague. It was directed, personal. Someone had known something. Someone had tried to warn him. Rick sat back and considered what kind of person would send this. An insider? A whistleblower? Someone Emily had once trusted and then discarded? He checked the metadata of the email. The IP address was masked, routed through a VPN in Toronto. It had come through a one-time secure relay server. No real trail, at least not one that could be followed easily. But then, something in the back of his mind clicked. A memory, barely formed. Months ago, during one of the last quarterly strategy reviews before the sale, he'd been approached by a junior compliance analyst at his company, someone from the audit team, with a request to cross-check some signatures on outdated estate planning files. At the time, it had seemed like a minor clerical issue. Rick had brushed it off, buried in closing paperwork. But the young man, Gavin, maybe? Had seemed uneasy, as if there was more he hadn't said. Rick opened an internal HR contact sheet he'd saved before shutting down the corporate servers. He scrolled down until he found the name, Gavin Ellerby, former junior audit associate. Mid-20s. Transferred to a West Coast firm 6 weeks before the acquisition. Rick checked LinkedIn. Gavin's profile was active, still in finance, now working at a boutique consulting firm in Portland. Without hesitating, Rick drafted a message. Gavin. I hope this finds you well. I'm reaching out about something you flagged several months ago, a discrepancy involving my estate documentation. I didn't take it seriously at the time, and I believe I should have. If you're willing, I'd like to ask a few questions. Please consider this confidential. No pressure, just hoping for a conversation. Rick Wallace. He hit send, then encrypted the message using his old corporate key, just in case Gavin still used the same protocols. Less than an hour later, Gavin replied. Mr. Wallace. I remember that situation very clearly. I hesitated to push further because of the corporate transition, but I had strong concerns at the time. I'd be willing to speak, but I'd prefer a secure call, or encrypted messaging only. I no longer have access to any of the original documents, but I recall certain details that didn't sit right with me. Rick agreed, and by mid-morning, they were on a secure call using an encrypted app. Gavin's voice was calm, but cautious. I appreciate you reaching out, sir, Gavin said. I've been thinking about this for a while. Tell me everything, Rick replied. Gavin explained that during a routine audit of legacy financial records for Wallace Systems, he'd come across 2 digital files embedded in a larger estate review package. One was a standard copy of Rick's living trust agreement. The other was labeled as an addendum, with language granting expanded authority to an unnamed third party in the event of Rick's incapacitation or death. The digital signature on the document was a perfect match to Rick's, too perfect. The signature was copied from a contract you signed back in 2019, Gavin said. There were identical curve overlaps, pixel patterns. No natural variation. That's when I realized it had been lifted and inserted digitally. Whoever did it was good, but not perfect. Rick felt a slow burn rise in his chest. I flagged it in my internal report, Gavin continued. But then, I was told to drop it. By someone in legal. A week later, I was moved to a different team. I didn't think anyone would listen if I pushed. Rick understood. Big companies buried minor problems all the time during acquisitions. No one wanted delays. No one wanted loose ends. Especially when money was on the table. Do you remember whose name was on the addendum? Rick asked. I do, Gavin said. It was Emily Wallace. Your daughter-in-law. Rick closed his eyes. Confirmation. Thank you, Gavin, he said after a pause. You did the right thing. After ending the call, Rick forwarded the audio file to Troy, along with the email thread and Gavin's number. Within 20 minutes, Troy responded. This seals it. I'll cross-reference the doc with the copy we pulled from her laptop. If it matches Gavin's version, we have the original forgery and chain of access. Also, the Florida lawyer, Langston, is dirtier than I thought. He's already under quiet investigation by the state bar for proxy filings tied to predatory inheritance transfers. Your daughter-in-law chose him for a reason. Rick exhaled slowly. The net was tightening. That evening, Rick watched Emily from the upstairs window as she stood in the backyard, barefoot in the grass, phone to her ear. She looked like a woman enjoying a warm night in early autumn, not someone unraveling from the inside. But Rick had seen too much now to be deceived by appearances. He checked his phone. The recording devices were still running. Every zone in the house was active, every word she spoke uploaded instantly to a secure server. Then, the phone buzzed. Another message from Troy. You need to see this in person. Tomorrow morning. Come alone. Rick replied with a single word, confirmed. Later that night, as he stood brushing his teeth, Mark knocked gently on the bathroom door. Rick opened it. Can we talk? Mark asked, voice low. They went downstairs to the darkened kitchen. Mark leaned against the counter, arms folded. I've been thinking about what you said. About Emily. About the documents. I'm trying to understand how I missed it. How I didn't see what she was doing. Rick poured them both a glass of water. You loved her. You trusted her. That's not a weakness. Mark shook his head. She's been pulling away for months. The Florida trips, the secrets, the pressure. I thought it was just stress. But now, I don't know who she is anymore. Rick watched his son, recognizing the same look he had seen in the mirror many times, betrayal, tightly controlled. She's not done yet, Rick said quietly. And I need you to be strong. Don't confront her. Don't change your behavior. Let her believe we're blind. Mark nodded slowly. And then what? Rick's eyes hardened. Then we finish what she started. But on our terms. The next morning, Rick left before sunrise. The mountains were still cloaked in shadows, and the air was sharp with early autumn chill. He drove alone to a nondescript office building in Denver, nestled between a medical supply warehouse and an old shipping depot. The front signage was vague, just a suite number and the word, consulting. Troy Daniels waited for him inside, already seated at a glass table in a small, windowless room that smelled faintly of stale coffee and paper. Without a word, Troy slid a thick manila folder across the table. Rick opened it and began flipping through the contents. Photos. Reports. Financial records. Surveillance notes. Names he recognized, and others he didn't. You're going to want to read page 7, Troy said. Rick did. It was a scanned document from a police file in New Jersey, dated over 15 years ago. A missing persons report. The name, Anthony Calderon. Age, 29. Last seen leaving a dinner party in Trenton. The report listed no suspects, but included a handwritten note from a detective, spoke to girlfriend, Emily Devers. No alibi confirmed. Inconclusive. Rick blinked and read it again. Emily Devers, he said slowly. Troy nodded. Her maiden name. Rick looked up, incredulous. She was involved in a missing person case? Technically, just listed as a point of contact. But dig deeper, and it gets worse. Calderon was a paralegal at a small firm where Deborah Devers, Emily's mother, also worked at the time. The firm specialized in elder law, estate planning, and probate disputes. That was Deborah's domain. Rick continued reading. There was a pattern. A string of questionable financial events surrounding Deborah Devers during the mid-2000s. Minor civil suits filed by the adult children of deceased clients, alleging financial mismanagement, forgery, and coercion. None of the cases had stuck, either dismissed for lack of evidence or settled quietly out of court. But there were enough of them to suggest a dangerous pattern. Deborah's license was suspended twice, Troy said. She moved states after the second time. Ended up in Colorado a few years later with a clean slate, new clients, and no formal charges on record. Rick flipped to a photo of a younger Deborah standing outside a courthouse. Even then, she had the same rigid posture, the same tightly controlled expression. Emily stood beside her, a teenager, blank-eyed. And what happened to Calderon? Rick asked. Troy shook his head. Never found. Declared legally dead after 7 years. No body. No leads. Just a few rumors. What kind of rumors? Troy hesitated, then slid another document across the table. This one came from an anonymous interview a private investigator filed years later. A former coworker claimed Calderon and Emily were involved romantically. Said he was planning to leave the firm and take documents with him, ones that could implicate Deborah in fraudulent activity. He confided in Emily. Then he vanished. Rick leaned back in the chair, gripping the arms tightly. So Emily has a history of aligning with people who manipulate money, then eliminating threats, he said. Troy nodded. It looks that way. Rick took a deep breath and closed the folder. What about now? Is Deborah still involved? That's where it gets murky, Troy said. Deborah seems less active now. No recent legal employment, no new business ventures. But she's still tied financially to Emily. Shared accounts. Co-signatures on some Florida real estate documents. Deborah may not be driving the plan, but she's benefiting from it, and she's complicit. Rick was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the weight of it all. Then he said, Deborah was the one who drank the champagne. Emily didn't flinch. That wasn't just a backup plan. That was a message. Troy frowned. You think Emily was warning her own mother? No, Rick said. I think she was reminding her. Later that day, Rick returned to the house. Emily was gone, having taken her car to town for a Pilates and errands day. Mark was home, sitting in the living room reading something on his tablet, his face drawn. When Rick walked in, he looked up. You found something, didn't you? Mark asked. Rick nodded and sat down across from him. It's worse than we thought. Mark listened without interrupting as Rick detailed the missing persons case, Deborah's legal past, and the suspected involvement in fraudulent activities. Mark said nothing for a long time after Rick finished. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. I never knew any of that. She never talked about her past. She always made it sound like she and her mom moved around a lot because of opportunity, job changes, better schools. Rick folded his hands together. That may have been true. But it wasn't the full story. Mark stood and paced across the room, his jaw clenched. I married into a lie. Rick stood too. No. You were targeted. Mark looked at him sharply. They picked you, Rick said. Or more accurately, they picked this family. Your name. My name. Our legacy. Our money. You think it's an accident that she got close to you just as I started succession planning? You think it's coincidence that she pushed for us to streamline our estate right when I was reviewing our corporate assets? Mark sat down heavily. I feel like a fool. You're not, Rick said. You're someone who believed. That's not foolish, that's human. Mark exhaled. What do we do now? We keep playing along, Rick said. We let her believe we're still blind. But we prepare the next move. That evening, Rick checked his secure server again. Troy had uploaded more recordings, including one from 2 nights prior when Emily had taken a late call in the backyard. I'm working on it, she had said to someone. He's not suspecting anything. We're almost there. The Florida accounts are set. Once the last piece is signed, we'll move the funds. Deborah's nervous, but she'll do what I tell her. Then, after a pause. Yes, I've spoken to Langston. He'll push the transfer through with the digital power of attorney. After that, it's just cleanup. Rick saved the recording, labeled it carefully, then made 3 encrypted copies stored in separate locations. The final piece, the last signature, had not happened yet. That meant he still had a window to act. At midnight, Rick walked silently through the house. Emily was asleep in the master bedroom. Mark had taken the guest room down the hall. Deborah was still recovering, quiet, but no longer ill. Rick stepped into his office, shut the door behind him, and pulled out a locked drawer. Inside, he removed an envelope, not a legal document, but something far more personal. A letter he had written nearly 5 years ago, never sent. It was addressed to Mark, explaining the origins of the company, his hopes for the future, and his fears about the kind of people wealth attracted. He had written it at a time when legacy felt more important than power. Now, it felt prophetic. He sat at his desk and began writing again, not a letter this time, but a declaration. A record of everything. Not for the courts. For the truth. The sun had not yet risen when Rick finished the handwritten account. It was 5 full pages, every word deliberate, every line tied to a date, a memory, a document, or a recording. He labeled it Personal Declaration, Confidential, Wallace Estate, signed and dated it, then locked it away in a fireproof box beneath his desk drawer, alongside a flash drive containing all the surveillance footage, audio files, and digital evidence Troy had collected. He made 2 additional copies, one for Troy, and one for his attorney, scheduled to be delivered by courier that same afternoon. By the time Emily entered the kitchen later that morning, Rick was already dressed in hiking clothes, sipping coffee, appearing completely at ease. He smiled at her, offered her the last blueberry muffin, and asked about her Pilates class. She smiled back, even made a comment about how she was feeling lighter lately, as if the darkness of the last week hadn't touched her at all. That, Rick realized, was her true strength, denial. Not ignorance, but the ability to actively ignore what she couldn't control until she found a way to dominate it. That made her dangerous, but also predictable. Later that day, Rick met with Troy in a downtown co-working office under a different name. They reviewed the compiled files, and Rick laid out the plan he had been constructing piece by piece since the night of the champagne switch. It wasn't just about stopping Emily. It was about removing her leverage completely. He needed to isolate her, legally, financially, and emotionally, before she made her final move. We go at this from 3 angles, Rick said. 1. Expose the forged power of attorney and freeze any pending transfers connected to my estate. 2. Use Mark's cooperation to create plausible tension between him and Emily, just enough for her to feel uncertain about where he stands. And 3. Get Deborah to crack. Troy nodded. She's your weakest link. She's already been drugged, manipulated, and left exposed. With the right pressure, she'll talk. Rick leaned forward. We don't force her. We let her fear do the work. By early evening, Mark joined Rick in the study. He looked more focused now, less lost. The shock of betrayal was still there, but it had settled into something colder, more controlled. I've been thinking about how to get her to let her guard down, Mark said. What if I stage a fight with you in front of her? Something ugly. She's been waiting for me to turn against you. Maybe if I feed that, she'll start telling me more. Rick nodded. It's risky, but it could work. Especially if she believes you're angry enough to want your inheritance early. They planned the details carefully. The next day, Mark would confront Rick in the kitchen, loudly, emotionally, over fabricated claims that Rick was planning to change the will. Emily would overhear the argument. They would let her believe that Mark was ready to join her in whatever plan she had left. The fight happened at noon sharp. You've always controlled everything. Mark shouted across the kitchen. Even now, even after retiring, you're still pulling the strings. You think I don't see it? Rick played his part perfectly, slamming a drawer shut and responding with quiet fury. When you've earned what I've earned, then you can lecture me about control. Emily had entered the room halfway through and stood frozen near the doorway, eyes flicking between them. Mark turned to her with bitter sarcasm. guess I better hope you don't drop dead before you change the paperwork." Then he stormed out. Rick waited until she followed him down the hallway, then slipped into his study and activated the audio feed. Emily's voice was quiet but sharp. "You need to calm down. We can't let him bait us." Mark's voice was convincing. "I'm done letting him treat me like a backup plan. If you've got a better one, I'm listening." There was a pause. Then Emily said, "I'll explain later. But yes, there's still a way to make sure everything ends up where it should. You just have to trust me." Mark didn't reply right away. Finally, he said, "I'm listening." The next part of Rick's strategy was more subtle. He had Troy deliver an anonymous tip to Deborah through a fake, concerned friend email. The message simply read, "He knows. Your name is on everything. She will let you fall first." It included no names, no details, just enough to stir panic. It worked. That night, Deborah knocked on Rick's office door, something she hadn't done since moving into the guest room to recover. She looked thinner, paler, and her hands trembled as she held a glass of water. "I need to talk to you," she said, voice barely above a whisper. Rick gestured for her to sit. She did, awkwardly, like her legs didn't quite know how to hold her weight anymore. She didn't look at him when she spoke. "I didn't know she was going to use me like that," she began. "She told me it was just to get your attention. A distraction. That she needed you vulnerable so she could talk to you about moving things over to Mark sooner." Rick said nothing. He let the silence hang. Deborah shook her head. "I should have walked away. But I didn't. Because I was scared. Because she said if I didn't help her, she'd tell people about the past." Rick leaned in. "What part of the past?" Deborah looked up sharply, her eyes wide. Then, finally, she said it. "Anthony. The man from New Jersey. Emily told me if I didn't help her now, she'd dig him up, metaphorically or literally. She said she had enough saved from those years to point everything back to me." Rick's expression didn't change, but inside, something shifted. He had confirmation now, not just of Emily's manipulation, but of her willingness to weaponize old crimes to keep her mother compliant. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked. Deborah's voice cracked. "Because I know what's coming. And I don't want to be dragged down with her." Rick nodded slowly. "You're not the first person she's used. But you might be the first one who can stop her." Deborah hesitated. "Would you protect me? If I gave you what you need?" Rick met her gaze without blinking. "Only if it's everything." Deborah reached into her cardigan and pulled out a flash drive. "She asked me to keep copies. Backups. Just in case. She didn't trust the lawyer completely. I didn't know what was on them until I looked." Rick took the drive gently, set it on the table, and slid a small sheet of paper toward her. "This is my lawyer's number. You'll call him tomorrow. Tell him everything. If you cooperate, we'll work to protect you from the worst." Deborah nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. After she left, Rick locked the door and opened the flash drive. Inside were copies of the forged documents, communication logs between Emily and Peter Langston, and internal memos showing attempts to alter the Wallace family trust using the false power of attorney. There were also drafts of emails Emily had written but never sent, some filled with cold, transactional language about closing out the Wallace line cleanly. The phrase made Rick recoil. He sent copies of the files to Troy and his attorney. Within hours, both replied with the same message: "This is enough." Rick sat back in his chair and looked out at the night. The trap had been set. All that remained now was the confrontation. The morning after Deborah handed over the flash drive, Rick sat alone at the breakfast table, staring at the untouched plate of eggs in front of him. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of wood adjusting to the cool mountain air. He hadn't seen Emily since the evening before. She had left a note on the kitchen counter: "Went to the spa, will be back late afternoon." He didn't believe a word of it, and now, neither did Mark. Mark entered the room quietly, still in the sweatshirt he had slept in. His eyes were red, not from lack of sleep but from something deeper, the slow, gnawing erosion of certainty. He poured himself a cup of coffee, didn't add sugar like usual, then sat across from his father without speaking. Rick waited. He didn't push. He didn't even look at his son directly. Instead, he folded the corner of the newspaper and sipped his coffee slowly. Finally, Mark spoke. "I knew something was off," he said. "Long before you did. I just didn't want to see it." Rick lowered the paper and looked at him. "What did you know?" Mark leaned forward, elbows on the table, hands wrapped around the mug like he needed it to keep himself grounded. "Little things," he began. "She started asking weird questions a few months after we got married, about your assets, your health, how the estate was structured. I thought she was just being practical. Planning for the future." He hesitated. "Then she started asking about your passwords. Your lawyer's name. When I asked why, she said it was just in case something happened and she needed to help handle things. She made it sound like a backup plan, like she was looking out for me." Rick studied his son's face carefully. "And you gave her that information?" Mark nodded slowly. "Not all of it. But enough." Rick kept his tone level. "What else?" Mark ran a hand through his hair and looked away, as if ashamed. "I found a file on her laptop 6 weeks ago. It was open when I walked into the room. She closed it fast, but not before I saw it. A scanned document with your name and signature, a change to your trust. I asked her about it, and she said you were finally transferring more control to us. Said you decided to let go of things early. Did you believe her?" "I didn't want to," Mark admitted. "But part of me thought, maybe it was true. Maybe you had done it quietly and hadn't told me yet. You've always kept things tight." Rick nodded. "And did she ask you to sign anything?" Mark hesitated again. "Yes. 2 weeks ago. A document she said was related to our joint financial planning. She told me it was about aligning our assets in case something happened to either of us. I didn't read it carefully. I just signed." Rick's chest tightened. "Do you have a copy?" Mark shook his head. "No. She didn't give me one." Rick leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling for a long moment. "You may have signed something used to authorize further changes to my estate. Possibly something fraudulent." Mark looked sick. "Jesus, Dad. I didn't know." "I believe you," Rick said. "But it means you've been part of this, even if you didn't intend to be." Mark set the coffee down, his hands shaking slightly. "I wanted to protect her. I thought she was protecting me. But now, everything feels like a setup." Rick stood and walked to the window, the bright morning light cutting across his face. "She used your name, your signature, your relationship with me. And she did it with full awareness of how deeply she was manipulating all of us." Mark stared at the floor. "So what do we do?" Rick turned back to him. "We finish what we started. You'll confront her. Privately. But you'll record it. I want to know exactly what she thinks you know, and what she's willing to admit." Mark didn't respond immediately. Then he nodded. "Okay. But if I do this, if I press her, she might turn on me too." "She will," Rick said plainly. "But that's exactly when she'll make her biggest mistake." That afternoon, Mark waited in the den, seated on the edge of the couch with a digital recorder running under the side table. When Emily returned, he greeted her with a forced smile and asked her to sit. She looked slightly flushed, her hair pulled back, still dressed in workout clothes. "You okay?" she asked, taking a seat. "You look stressed." Mark didn't waste time. "I know about the document." Emily froze. "What document?" "The one you had me sign. The one you said was about our joint assets." Emily tilted her head, feigning confusion. "It was. Why are you bringing this up now?" Mark leaned forward. You lied to me, Emily. I saw the file on your laptop. I know it wasn't a basic financial form. And I know it had my father's name on it. Her smile faltered. You're tired. Maybe you misunderstood. No, Mark said, his voice firm now. I think you forged his signature. I think you used mine. I think you and that Florida lawyer planned to push through changes to my father's estate, with or without his approval. Emily stood. Stop. You don't know what you're talking about. I know enough, Mark said, standing too. I know about the backup files you gave your mother. I know about the calls to Langston. I know about the power of attorney. Her face twisted, her eyes narrowing. You've been spying on me? I've been surviving you. There was a pause, thick with tension. Then Emily said quietly, you always were too weak for this. What does that mean? She walked toward the window, arms crossed. You think this life just happens? You think people like your father built an empire by being noble and cautious? No. They took control. They used leverage. I was doing the same, for us. You drugged my grandmother, Mark said. You could have killed her. She's not your grandmother, Emily snapped. And she was never supposed to drink it. Mark stepped forward. What was supposed to happen? Emily didn't answer. Tell me, he demanded. She turned to him, her expression cold. He was supposed to feel disoriented. Out of control. Vulnerable. That's when we'd introduce the final documents, the ones he wouldn't remember signing. He'd wake up the next morning and think it was his idea. Mark stared at her. You were going to dismantle everything. I was going to secure everything, she said. For us. Before he gave it away to some foundation or trust or started dividing it up between people who had no idea what it took to build. Mark's face hardened. That's not your choice to make. Emily stepped closer. And what are you going to do now? Go crying to your father? Tell him you signed something you didn't understand? That you were too stupid to see what was happening? Mark held her gaze. No. I'm going to let you keep talking. Emily's brow furrowed. What? The soft click from the corner of the room told her everything. She spun toward the side table, pulling open the drawer. Her face drained of color when she saw the recording device blinking. Mark didn't move. You set me up, she whispered. You set all of us up, he replied. She stared at him for several long seconds, then turned and walked out without another word. Later that night, Mark handed Rick the recording. She confessed to everything, he said. Not just the documents, the plan, the sedative, even the motive. Rick placed the device on his desk and looked at his son. You did good. Mark sat down. So now what? Rick didn't hesitate. Now we bring it all down. And we do it legally. Rick sat behind the glass wall of Troy's rented research room past dusk, the skyline of Denver gleaming beyond. Every light in front of him felt like a signal. Someone was watching, someone was waiting. Troy stood near the window, hands clasped behind his back, staring out. At Rick's side lay a stack of printed bank statements, transaction logs, and digital maps tracing routes between Florida and Colorado. The level of coordination Emily had achieved was broader than Rick had suspected. We've pulled up several real estate entities in Florida tied to shell companies, Troy said. One in particular, Langston and Fields Trust, owns 4 parcels under different names. One of them is registered to Emily's maiden name. The others are in numbers tied to her mother's social security number or Deborah's previous Florida addresses. Rick rubbed his eyes. Are they active? Barely. All 4 have minimal public interaction, property taxes paid, basic maintenance contracts, that's it. But I found that one had a lien taken out 3 months ago. The loan amount was sizable, and paperwork shows payments tied back to Langston and Fields Trust. Troy turned to Rick. Meaning, someone is preparing for liquidity, selling or transferring. Rick leaned forward. So the financial firepower is ready. The best case scenario is she sells before we can freeze the assets. Worst case, she moves everything and disappears. Troy nodded. That's why this next move must be swift. But there's more. He handed Rick an envelope. Something came up in her phone records. See this? Calls to a number in Tampa. 4 calls. After hours. 2 of them very short, one about 15 minutes, one almost an hour. On one of those shorter ones, location pinged near Peter Langston's office. Rick's heart thumped. The Florida lawyer was more than a paper name now, he was active in this web. And, Troy continued, there's a man named Greg Ortega. Langston's associate. He has financial ties to Deborah's past firms. Invoices for consulting, some of them with vague descriptions, asset realignment, trust facilitation, estate restructuring. Some of them match dates Emily was flying to Florida. Rick closed his eyes. Emily had woven a web across states. The threads ran through forged documents, property titles, monetary transfers, and now orchestrated legal assistance. The scope was terrifying. Do you think Langston is complicit or being used? Rick asked. Complicit, Troy said. He's not a clean lawyer. He's done trust work in Florida before, and there are whispers about his being under scrutiny by the state bar for elder estate filings that look like they favored people in aggressive circumstances. Nothing proven yet, but enough to leverage. Rick rose from his chair and rubbed the back of his neck. He walked over to the window and looked down at the parked cars, the traffic lights blinking. The distance between here and Tampa felt both immense and dangerously small. I want something concrete, Rick said. Not rumors. I want a document with Langston's signature, tied to transfers. I want financial statements showing where those shell companies' funds came from. If we have that, we have more than enough to go to the judiciary, possibly criminal. Troy smirked slightly. Already requested. Some of the transfer records are pending. With your signature forgery case, this will build a chain. The attorney-client privilege might protect some communications, but ownership and title records are public. Langston's documents are recorded, especially for real estate. He paused. We need to keep Emily talking. Rick nodded. That fight you recorded earlier between Mark and Emily, that'll help. But I want more. I want her to relax. Let her think she's winning. Then we corner her. Over the next day, Rick continued to play his part. He pretended to distrust Mark, let Emily overhear him questioning whether he should reassign parts of his trusts, as though he might change the will again. He made subtle remarks, loud enough for her to hear, about modifying power of attorney, revising joint accounts. Emily would respond in kind, soft reassurance, empty overtures to compromise. But under the surface, Troy's investigators kept peeling layers. Late that evening, Troy sent Rick a text, "Got what you asked." A PDF arrived, a deed dated 2 weeks back for one of the Florida parcels, signed by Peter Langston, witnessed by someone with Deborah's full name, recorded in the county property office. The same signature matched in forensics to one of those forged documents Mark had seen. Another file, bank transfer of $500,000 from Langston and Fields Trust to a newly formed LLC in which Emily and Deborah are silent partners, under their Florida addresses. The LLC has no listed business operations, just property holdings. Rick's pulse surged. He glanced toward the front door, listening for any signs of Emily. The house was dark, quiet. Mark was in bed. Deborah slept in the guest room. He shut his laptop and exhaled. That night, he drifted off to the recordings of Emily and Langston's phone calls, snippets and fragments of promises and manipulation, all now mapping out a larger scheme. At dawn, Rick walked into the study to find Mark already there. His face was grave. "She knows the deed is out there," Mark said without speaking first. "She texted me this morning, be careful. Things are slipping. I hear voices." Mark's thumb hovered over his phone. "I didn't reply." Rick nodded. "Good. Let her feel it. Fear is a mirror. Whatever trembles in us trembles in her. Mark swallowed. What now? With the equity tied up in those Florida properties, how quickly can a freeze be placed? And how sure is this deed legitimate? Rick opened the deed, looked closely at the signatures, compared dates. Troy's forensic says it matches other documents, including the forged ones. As for freezing, if we move now, I can get a temporary injunction from the court. We'll need a judge willing to freeze assets linked to forgery. But with Deborah's cooperation, Mark's recorded confession, and the financials, I believe my lawyer can make the case. A clear resolve settled in Rick's stance. We file immediately. Langston, Emily, Deborah, all named. We put in motion not just civil claims but possible criminal referrals. Forgery, fraud, conspiracy. Mark's voice was husky. Are you worried she'll disappear with the money first? Rick's eyes sharpened. That's why we need to move quickly. But also subtly. Leak enough of the evidence publicly? Maybe a trusted news outlet. Don't want sensationalism, want accuracy. Let the threat of exposure pressure her more than our legal moves yet. They worked through the morning. Calls to lawyers, assembling exhibits. Rick's pulse thrummed with tension, the kind that comes when one seizes back control after realizing they've been sleepwalking into a trap. There were risks. Emily could counterclaim, accuse him of paranoia, leak personal things, maybe accuse Deborah of colluding. But the balance had shifted. That evening, Emily returned. She walked through the front door, arms full of groceries, the scent of fresh bread and herbs trailing behind. Rick was in the kitchen, feigning reading an investment newsletter. Mark had his tablet out. Deborah was in the living room, eyes red but looking resolute. The atmosphere was electric, calm, but crackling. Emily looked at them. I didn't hear anything about filings, she said, voice controlled. You seem distant. Rick folded the newsletter. I've been thinking about liability. About what legacy means. About what gets left behind. He paused, studying Emily's face. There are things I found. Things I'll be defending, things I'll be fighting. Emily's lips parted. Her eyes flickered, shock? Anger? Something between resignation and calculation. Rick stood. You'll be hearing from my attorney. Emily straightened, her face folding briefly into something unreadable. Then she nodded. I expected it would come to this. Mark's chest tightened. Deborah watched with tears in her eyes, but nodding too. Not hope, exactly, relief. Closure. The devise of control shifting again. Rick raised his chin. I didn't want betrayal to define my final years. But I also won't watch it be written behind my back. Emily said nothing further. She looked around the kitchen, her eyes lingering on his face, then on Mark, then Deborah. The silence that followed carried the weight of all that had transpired, forged papers, crimes of trust, weaponized love. And between them, the dangerous connections Emily had built wavered under scrutiny. Rick breathed out, steady. The next move was exposure. The following morning brought with it the hush of a Colorado autumn, the kind of stillness that settled over the Wallace estate like fog, not yet touched by frost but weighed down by anticipation. Rick stood in his office, the documents freshly printed and arranged on the polished wood table. They were ready, affidavits, audio transcripts, forensic analyses of digital signatures, and a verified motion for injunction already filed and time-stamped by the court. A hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, but Rick had no intention of waiting until then to deliver the reality of consequences to Emily's face. He had summoned her to his office mid-morning. Not a request. A direct call. No cryptic message, no passive tone. When she entered, Rick was already standing. Emily's demeanor had shifted over the last 24 hours. Her voice had grown quieter, her movements more deliberate. She was no longer trying to charm. She was calculating, recalibrating. The mask was still there, but it no longer fit as seamlessly as it once had. You wanted to speak? She asked, her tone neutral, not defensive. Rick gestured to the seat across from him. Sit. She did. No hesitation. That surprised him. For a brief second, he wondered if she believed she still had the upper hand. If she thought she could spin, deny, manipulate. "I filed a civil suit," Rick said plainly. "Naming you, Deborah, Peter Langston, and 3 entities linked to forged transfers of property and financial control." Emily blinked slowly, expression unreadable. "That's a bold move." "I have the recordings," Rick continued. "From the phone calls. From your conversation with Mark. From the night of the party. I have a forensic analyst's report confirming that my signature on the Langston Trust Amendment was lifted from a 2019 contract. I have evidence of coercion, fraud, and attempted financial abuse." Emily said nothing. Rick leaned forward. "What I don't have is a full confession. But I'm giving you one chance, right now, to explain yourself. Not to save yourself. That time is gone. But if there's anything left in you that's still human, you'll take this opportunity to speak plainly." Emily was silent for a long moment. Her eyes didn't move from his. Then, finally, she let out a breath that sounded more like resignation than relief. "You always underestimated me," she said quietly. "From the beginning. You treated me like someone who married into the family but didn't belong in it." "You were right," Rick said coldly. Emily's jaw tensed. "I knew what I was walking into. I knew your money came with strings. Expectations. Power games. You wanted someone grateful, obedient. Not someone who actually understood the system you built." Rick's voice didn't rise. "I wanted someone who didn't lie. Who didn't conspire. Who didn't turn my own son into a pawn." She laughed under her breath. "Mark was never a pawn. He was a shield. And for a while, he was willing to believe whatever I told him, until he wasn't. Until you got to him. He got to the truth on his own," Rick said. "That's the difference between the two of you." Emily leaned back in her chair, her expression cooling. "So what now? You sue me? Try to bleed me in court? You'll spend the rest of your retirement watching your own son be dragged through depositions, hearings, media noise? You really want that legacy?" Rick held her gaze. "You already tried to take everything. I'm just returning the favor, legally." Emily stood then, slowly. She didn't look shaken. She looked like someone cataloging every escape route in a burning room. "You think this is over," she said, "but it's not. You've disrupted a process, a system built over years. Langston isn't some penny chaser. He has reach. Protection." Rick rose too. "Then let him come. I have the proof. I have the law. And I have a network of people who don't flinch." Emily tilted her head, studying him. "You really think all of this is about money?" Rick's eyes narrowed. "No. This is about power. And the way people like you try to take it from those who built it." She stepped closer, voice low. "I didn't take anything you weren't going to waste. Your foundation donations? Your slow transition into public service? That wasn't legacy, it was guilt. You wanted to give everything away before anyone realized how much damage you'd done building it." Rick didn't answer. There was a flicker of rage behind his eyes, but it was cold, composed. "You're right about one thing," he said finally. "I was trying to make peace with my past. Trying to build something that would last longer than a product, a brand, or a company name. But not by giving it to someone like you." Emily turned to go. Rick spoke one last time before she reached the door. "Don't leave town." She paused, hand on the doorknob. "Is that a threat?" "No," Rick replied. "It's advice." She didn't respond. She walked out. When the door clicked shut, Rick sat back down, hands on the armrests, his breath steady. He called Troy. "She's going to try something," Rick said. Let her, Troy replied. Every move she makes now will tighten the case. That night, Rick convened a private meeting with his legal team, Mark and Deborah. They reviewed the suit, the schedule of evidence, and prepared statements. Deborah, under legal guidance, signed a sworn declaration admitting her role, disclosing Emily's manipulation, and affirming the legitimacy of the flash drive's contents. Mark asked the only question that lingered in the air once the legal points were addressed. Do you think she'll run? Rick shook his head. No. Not yet. She still thinks she has leverage. And if she does? Mark pressed. Rick looked at him, the wear of weeks in his eyes, but a fire still burning beneath. Then I'll burn that leverage down. By the end of the week, subpoenas were issued. A temporary freeze was placed on all Wallace-associated assets in Florida under the flagged LLC's, Langston's office, when contacted for verification of ownership transfers, responded through counsel, carefully, tentatively. The legal wall was rising. Emily remained quiet. She didn't challenge the suit, not publicly. But Rick knew better than to mistake silence for surrender. He knew a confrontation in court was inevitable. But before then, there would be one final move. One last layer of truth waiting to surface, and one more deception yet to be exposed. The early autumn rain tapped against the large study window as Rick sat at his desk reviewing the latest court notices. Legal gears were turning swiftly now. Emily's silence had held, but her legal representation had finally acknowledged receipt of the civil complaint, a quiet signal that the battle had entered its next phase. Deborah had kept mostly to herself over the past few days. Her room remained closed, her presence almost spectral. Meals left untouched, conversations brief and guarded. But Rick knew something was shifting behind that silence. It wasn't just guilt anymore. It was fear, the fear of what else might surface now that the dam had broken. Late that afternoon, she appeared in the doorway of Rick's office without knocking. Her hands were clasped together tightly, her eyes red-rimmed, not from crying, from exhaustion. She looked like someone who had been running from something for far too long. Rick set the folder aside and gestured for her to sit. She did, but hesitated to speak. "What is it, Deborah?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap. Finally, she said, "I haven't told you everything." Rick didn't respond. He waited. "You asked me before about Anthony Calderon," she said. "About whether Emily had anything to do with his disappearance." Rick nodded. "You said Emily was involved with him. That he was threatening to expose fraudulent activities at your old firm." Deborah stared down at her hands. "That was true. But I lied about something else. Anthony didn't just vanish. He died. And I was there when it happened." Rick's breath caught. He said nothing, letting her continue. "It wasn't murder, not in the way you might think," she said quickly. "But it wasn't an accident either. We were in the office late. Anthony had found evidence that I'd altered billing statements for 2 elderly clients. He confronted me. Said he was going to the police. I panicked. I tried to talk him down, told him he was overreacting. Emily came in. She wasn't supposed to be there, but she had been staying with me after a fight with her father." Deborah swallowed hard. He and Emily started shouting. She was furious. She told him he was manipulating me. That he was just trying to use the firm's name to blackmail us. He pushed her. Not hard, but enough. She slipped on a wet spot on the floor. I went to help her, and Anthony stepped back, and fell. He hit the edge of the filing cabinet. Hard. He didn't get up. Rick's voice was calm, but sharp. "You called for help?" Deborah shook her head. "We didn't. Emily said it would ruin everything. That no one would believe it was an accident. That it was self-defense, or a mistake, it didn't matter. We were 2 women in a firm with a history of complaints. And Anthony had a spotless record." Rick exhaled slowly, already seeing how the rest had played out. "We moved him," Deborah continued. That was her idea. She took charge. Told me to get bleach, trash bags, gloves. We wrapped the body, transported it to an abandoned property that was still under my name from a probate case I had managed months earlier. We buried him behind the garage. She made it look like he'd simply vanished. The office was cleaned. His car left at a park. We even sent a fake resignation email from his account. Rick stared at her, stunned by the depth of planning. Deborah was crying now, but quietly, like someone long past the point of dramatic emotion. I tried to forget it. I told myself it wasn't murder. That it was panic. That Emily was just protecting me. But now, I know better. Rick leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking. She's used it against you ever since. Deborah nodded. Every time I wanted to walk away. Every time I hesitated. She'd remind me. Not directly. Just enough to keep me in line. She controlled me with that secret for over 15 years. Rick stood and walked to the window, the rain still softly falling beyond the glass. And if I go to the police now? Deborah looked up. I'll testify. I'll tell them everything. I'm tired of running. But I can't do it alone. Rick turned back. You won't have to. But we need to handle this carefully. That night, he contacted Troy, who put him in touch with a former prosecutor now working in private legal consultation. They arranged for Deborah to give a preliminary statement, off the record for now, to establish intent to cooperate. The statement was recorded, time-stamped, and sealed. The next morning, Mark joined them in the office, his face pale as Deborah recounted the events again, this time in more legal terms. The silence afterward was long. She used you, Mark said finally. She used all of us. Deborah looked at him, the pain etched deep. I let her. Rick turned to his son. We now have something bigger than financial fraud. We're dealing with obstruction, tampering with evidence, and possibly unlawful disposal of a body. Mark looked like he might be sick. She killed someone. Rick corrected him. She covered it up. That's where her power has always lived, in silence. In the spaces where people are too scared to speak. That afternoon, Troy returned with more files. Langston had begun to move assets. One of the shell companies was attempting to offload a property through a third-party buyer, a last-minute liquidation to pull cash out fast. The judge's injunction, however, had been processed in time. The sale froze before it could close. Panic was setting in. Emily had yet to make any public statement. But a private message arrived at Rick's encrypted email that evening. I hope you know what you're doing. If I go down, I won't be the only one. Rick forwarded it to his lawyer and Troy. No response necessary. Deborah, meanwhile, had begun the process of preparing a full statement with legal counsel present. The plan was to bring the truth about Anthony Calderon to the authorities once the estate case was secure and once protections were negotiated. Mark asked the only question Rick himself had been trying to suppress. What if they dig him up? Rick didn't blink. Then we tell the truth. And let the law do the rest. In the silence that followed, the weight of what they were doing, what they were about to expose, settled fully on the house. But beneath the weight was something else. A sense of nearing the end. The air inside Rick's house had changed. Conversations were shorter, movements slower, each person carrying a tension that had yet to fully unfold. After Deborah's confession and the legal actions initiated, the house no longer felt like a home but rather the staging ground of a legal and moral battle nearing its final clash. Rick's days were filled with meetings, document reviews, and quiet phone calls with attorneys and Troy's investigative team. The lawsuit had advanced, the courts had accepted the injunction, and a preliminary hearing was scheduled within a week. Deborah's testimony was formally drafted, reviewed by a legal representative, and then submitted to the local district attorney's office under a cooperation clause that would, if accepted, spare her jail time in exchange for full transparency. She signed without hesitation. Mark had been silent most of that morning, sitting outside on the stone steps, nursing a cup of coffee long gone cold. Rick joined him, not speaking at first. They sat side by side, the pine trees stretching above them, the air dry with early October wind. "She hasn't contacted me," Mark finally said. "Not since the message you got." Rick nodded. "She knows it's closing in. She's recalculating." Mark turned toward his father. "Do you think she's capable of doing something worse? If she sees no way out?" Rick didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Desperate people don't think clearly. She might try to disappear. Or take a deal. But yes, she's capable of worse." Mark looked out at the trees. "I loved her." Rick placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "That's why this hurts more than anything else. Because it wasn't just fraud. It was betrayal." That afternoon, Troy arrived in person, not through messages, not by video. He stepped through the front door, face grim, holding a padded folder under one arm. "I wasn't going to send this electronically," he said, handing the folder to Rick. "Found something that's going to turn the court's stomach." Rick opened it. Inside was a printout of a private email chain recovered from Langston's server. Between Langston and Emily. Dated months ago. The subject line read, "Final Step, POA Enforcement Timeline." In the emails, Emily was instructing Langston on how to execute a final step in their estate restructuring plan. The language was euphemistic but damning. "Once Mr. Wallace is incapacitated, we will proceed with immediate implementation. His current hesitation is an obstacle that can be managed through controlled intervention. Ensure Deborah is ready to document compliance post-execution." There were attachments, outlines of legal steps, forged notarizations in draft, and a note suggesting Mark's signature had already been applied and would be finalized under duress if necessary. Rick stared at the page. "They plan to drug me again," he said quietly. "Or worse." Troy nodded. "That was always part of it. The sedative at the party was just the rehearsal." Mark was standing in the doorway now, having heard enough to piece it together. "So if you hadn't switched the glass, they would have moved everything that night," Rick finished. "Deborah would have been forced to sign a statement verifying my consent. You would have been pushed to affirm what you'd supposedly agreed to. And by the time I woke up, if I did, it would have all been done." Mark sank into the chair across from them, his hands trembling. Rick closed the folder slowly. "This goes to the prosecutor immediately. Langston is no longer just a co-conspirator. He's a predator." "Already in motion," Troy said. "But you need to prepare. This trial may go public. Media could get wind of it. Emily might use that." Rick stood and crossed to the window. "Let them talk. Let the truth be ugly. I'd rather face noise than silence." That evening, he called his attorney. A formal motion was filed to convert the civil complaint into a dual action, civil and criminal. Rick knew the risks. Court battles could drag out, reputations could be damaged. But he was no longer thinking about his name. He was thinking about what would be left when the dust settled, not assets, but dignity. He also made another decision. One he had resisted for months. He rewrote his will. It no longer included Emily in any form. All joint designations were removed. All conditional clauses voided. The updated document focused on Mark, structured to protect him from undue influence, and included detailed plans for philanthropy, trust funds for future grandchildren, and legal protections to prevent anyone outside the immediate family from attempting to influence distributions. It was filed, notarized, and sealed the next day. 3 days later, the court issued a summons for Emily and Langston to appear in a pretrial hearing. Deborah's testimony had been accepted under a sealed cooperation agreement, and Mark's recordings had been submitted to the court as evidence. The family met in the kitchen that night, the weight of the week pressing down on them. "It's going to get loud," Rick said. "Lawyers, reporters, maybe even investigators digging through our personal lives." Deborah nodded. "I'm ready." Mark looked at his father. What happens after? Rick smiled faintly. After what? After this is over. Rick sipped his water and set the glass down. Then we get quiet. We get small. We protect what matters. And we never, ever let something like this happen again. Outside, the wind had picked up. The trees swayed in rhythm, branches bending without breaking. Mark leaned back, his voice soft. Do you think she'll show up to court? Rick didn't hesitate. Yes. She'll come. She won't run. She'll try to spin it. Frame herself as the victim. She always thinks she's the smartest person in the room. Deborah added, she was. Until now. The next morning, Rick received a call from his attorney. Emily's legal team had filed a countermotion, a claim of undue influence, suggesting that Rick had used coercion to turn Mark and Deborah against her. It was weak, but dangerous, a public accusation that could sway media coverage. They're playing the perception game now, the attorney said. She's prepping for the court of public opinion. Rick remained calm. Let her. That court doesn't handle evidence. He hung up the phone and walked into his study. On his desk was a small box. Inside it was the champagne glass from the night of the party. Still clean, still untouched. He lifted it gently, turned it in his hand. The object that had started it all. The moment his instincts had whispered that something was wrong. He placed it back in the box and locked it away. This war had begun with a glass raised in celebration, and nearly ended in silence. But not now. Not with the truth finally stepping into the light. The courtroom was colder than Rick expected. Not in temperature, but in tone, its air dry, its walls bare, its architecture austere and uninterested in the emotions of those seated within it. There were no sweeping declarations, no theatrical cross-examinations. Just the mechanical rhythm of legal procedure, voices echoing softly off marble, files exchanged like chess pieces, and the methodical deconstruction of a plan built on deception. Emily sat at the defense table in a muted gray blazer, her expression unreadable. Her hair was tied back. Her posture straight. But her eyes, once confident, almost smug, held a distance now. Not weakness, but calculation undone. For the first time, Rick saw not a predator, but a strategist who had lost her map. Langston sat beside her, hands folded, lips drawn tight. The prosecution had moved swiftly, thanks to Deborah's cooperation and the meticulous documentation provided by Troy's team. There were no long deliberations. The judge granted the injunction on all Wallace family assets tied to the forged documents. The forged signatures were confirmed. The forensic testimony was clear. The motion to suppress Deborah's signed affidavit failed. Emily's defense pivoted. They argued manipulation. That Deborah had acted independently. That Rick had orchestrated this retaliation to punish a woman who challenged patriarchal control of the Wallace legacy. That Emily had been duped into trusting her husband's family. The court didn't bite. 2 days into the hearing, Mark took the stand. He spoke clearly, steadily. He admitted his mistakes. He acknowledged the moment he realized Emily had manipulated his trust, used his name, forged his role in a scheme he never agreed to. She was never afraid of the truth, he told the court. She was afraid of exposure. The courtroom remained still. No interruptions. No rebuttal. By the 5th day, Emily's legal team requested a recess to negotiate a settlement. Rick and his attorneys agreed, but only on the condition that all assets tied to the fraudulent activity would be forfeited, and that no claim to the Wallace estate, current or future, would be made under Emily's name. Langston's license was suspended pending further investigation by the state bar. Deborah's testimony, formally submitted, became a key piece in the forthcoming criminal case against him. Emily accepted the terms in silence. The judge issued an order of protection for Rick, Mark, and Deborah, barring Emily from making contact for at least 1 year, pending criminal investigations. She walked out of the courtroom without looking back. It was over. But the silence that followed wasn't celebration. It was the quiet of survival. A week later, Rick sold the house. Not out of fear, but clarity. Too many shadows lingered in the hallways, too many memories stitched into the walls. He bought a smaller home outside Estes Park, quieter, older, surrounded by trees instead of polished driveways. He told Mark he wanted space. Not distance. Just room to breathe. Mark visited often. They hiked. They worked on the foundation Rick had once dreamed of. Now it had a new charter, not just education and technology access, but legal literacy and elder protection. Deborah stayed silent through most of the transition. She refused interviews. Refused settlement offers. She gave one final statement to the investigators assigned to Langston's case, then returned to New Jersey to live near her sister. Her part in this story, Rick believed, had ended with truth. One evening, months later, Rick invited Mark for dinner. It was the first snow of the season. Pine needles sagged under soft white powder, and the windows glowed with warm light as father and son sat at the kitchen table with grilled salmon, roasted potatoes, and 2 glasses of sparkling water. Rick raised his glass. "No champagne?" Mark joked. Rick smiled. "I've learned my lesson." They clinked glasses gently. The toast wasn't ceremonial. It wasn't dramatic. Just a simple gesture between 2 men who had been broken and rebuilt by the same storm. "To what?" Mark asked after a moment. Rick didn't hesitate. "To the ones who stayed." They drank. Outside, snow continued to fall, erasing footsteps, softening every edge of the world. Rick watched it from the window, hands in his pockets, the old leather-bound notebook sitting open on the desk behind him. A new entry was written in it, short, just a few lines. It began with silence. It ended with voice. "I trusted my instincts, but I trusted the truth more. And in the end, that's what saved me." He closed the notebook, extinguished the lights, and stepped into the quiet night. The fight for legacy was over. Now, it was time to live it.